Clara May Holloway drove both hands into a barrel of rotting animal fat, hauled up a dripping, reeking mass of it, and dropped it into her pail, and she did it while Thomas Bellamy stood 3 feet away, laughing so hard his face turned red. While Caleb Foster shouted from across the street that she'd finally lost her mind, while every woman on that block turned away in disgust, and she never once looked up from what she was doing, because she had a notebook full of numbers that said every single one of them was wrong. If this story moves you, subscribe to this channel right now, hit that bell, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far Clara's story travels. Now let's go back to where it all began. The smell was the first thing. Always the first thing. Thick, rancid. The kind of smell that hit the back of your throat and stayed there. Animal fat left in open barrels in the August heat behind Bellamy's butcher shop, sitting in the sun, drawing flies, turning in on itself until even the dogs that wandered through the alley gave it a wide pass. Clara May Holloway walked straight toward it. She was 32 years old, built heavy and solid from a lifetime of physical work, with hands so roughened from washing other people's laundry that she barely felt the coarse wood of the barrel rim anymore. She had been up since 4 in the morning. She had already delivered 3 loads of clean laundry before the sun cleared the mountains. She had 5 more stops to make before dark, and she was here, at 6:45 in the morning, behind the butcher shop, doing something nobody in Willow Creek, Colorado had any explanation for. Thomas Bellamy came around the corner of his building and stopped short when he saw her. Miss Holloway. He looked at the barrel, looked at her. Looked at the handcart she'd parked against the wall. You're actually here. I said I would be. I thought you might have come to your senses overnight. I came to collect my pails, Mr. Bellamy. He leaned against the wall with his arms crossed, watching her work, and she could hear from his breathing that he was working very hard not to laugh. He lost that fight in about 30 seconds. 2 cents a pail, he said, laughing. Lord Almighty, Clara Holloway, what are you going to do with it? That's my business. You smell that? That right there is what you paid for. I'm aware. You need help loading it? I can get my boy. I don't need help, Clara said flatly. I need you to stay out of my way. That stopped his laughing. Not because she said it hard, she said it quiet, the way you say something that doesn't require any emphasis because it's simply true. He straightened up, slightly surprised, and she finished loading the first pail onto her cart without looking at him again. It was when she came around to the front of the building, handcart loaded, that Caleb Foster spotted her from across the street. Caleb ran the feed store. He was a lean, sharp-jawed man of 45 who had a comment ready for everything and enough time on his hands to deliver it. He was standing outside the barber shop with 2 other men, Henry Moss from the grain mill and a traveling salesman whose name Clara had never bothered to learn, and the 3 of watched her come around the corner with the loaded cart and the rancid smell preceding her by a good 10 yards. Well, I'll be, Caleb said, loud enough to carry across the whole street. Clara Holloway hauling garbage at sunrise. You see that, Henry? I see it, Henry said. Woman your size ought to be hauling something worth hauling, Caleb called out. The salesman laughed. Clara kept walking. Were you taking it, Clara? You opening a garbage business? That'd be about right. She pushed the cart forward. The wheels needed grease, she'd been putting it off, and they made a grinding sound with every rotation that drew even more attention than she already had. A woman coming out of the dry goods store stopped and stared. 2 children on the boardwalk pointed. Don't point, their mother said, pulling them back. But she was staring too. Clara looked straight ahead. She had learned something years ago, the hard way, that attention from people like Caleb Foster only had as much power as you handed it. The moment you stopped walking, the moment you turned around to answer, the moment you let your face show anything, that was the moment you lost. So she kept her face neutral and her feet moving and her hands steady on the cart, and she thought about her grandmother, and she thought about numbers, and she went home. Her name was Eliza May, Clara's grandmother. She'd grown up on a farm in Tennessee where nothing was wasted because nothing could afford to be. Every scrap of fat from every slaughtered animal was saved. Every bucket of wood ash from the fireplace collected. Every drop of rainwater caught and used. She had made soap every spring for 50 years, standing over a cast-iron pot in the side yard, and the soap she made lasted longer and cleaned better than anything you could buy from a store. Clara had stood beside her as a girl and watched every step. "You paying attention?" Eliza May would say. "Yes, ma'am." "Don't watch my hands. Watch what's happening. There's a difference." Clara had watched what was happening. She'd been 12 years old, and she hadn't understood then why her grandmother insisted on the distinction, but she understood it now. Her grandmother wasn't teaching her a recipe. She was teaching her to read a process, to understand cause and effect well enough to improvise, correct, adjust. To think, not just repeat. That was what Clara was carrying home in those pails, along with the smell and the stares, and Caleb Foster's voice still ringing faintly behind her. Her grandmother's lesson. It had been sitting unused inside her for 20 years, and she was going to use it now. She had spent the previous 2 weeks building her setup in the back of the property, a simple ash filter from old boards and packed straw, a fire pit with space for her largest iron pot, a curing rack made from fence timber. She'd done all of it at dawn or after dark, when the light was low enough that casual passersby couldn't see exactly what she was constructing. Not because she was ashamed, because she knew that once people in Willow Creek understood what she was doing, the opinions would start arriving before she had anything to defend. And she needed to be further along than that before she was ready to defend it. She unloaded the pails. She stoked the fire. She started rendering. The rendering process was slow and required attention. She worked the fat in small batches, maintaining steady heat, stirring regularly, straining out the impurities through cloth until what remained in the pot was clean, liquid tallow, pale gold. Relatively odorless now, nothing like what it had started at. She collected wood ash from her fireplace, ran rainwater through it slowly, tested the lye concentration the way her grandmother had shown her a raw potato dropped in, watching for the float, checking the surface reaction. Too weak. She ran it through again better. She combined the tallow and the lye water, in careful proportions, watching the temperature, stirring slow and steady. The mixture thickened. It moved differently. The chemistry was working. She poured it into the wooden molds she'd made from fence boards lined with cloth, smoothed the surface flat, covered it all with burlap to hold the warmth, and walked away. She did not let herself check for 5 days. She did laundry. She delivered it. She collected payment. She bought flour and salt and a new candle at Caldwell's, said nothing to Everett Caldwell about anything, came home, and did not go to the back of the property. On the 5th morning she went and stopped. The soap had not set. She pressed one finger into the surface and it gave way completely, soft and greasy and wrong. She worked around all 6 molds, same result. Not soap. Not even close to soap. Something in between. Something failed. Something that had started the right process and then stopped. She stood there in the cold September air and looked at what 2 weeks of planning and 2 cents a pail and her grandmother's lessons had produced. Soft, greasy, worthless. She heard Caleb Foster's voice in her head without wanting to. Woman your size ought to be hauling something worth hauling. She heard Thomas Bellamy's laugh. She heard, from somewhere deeper and older, the quiet voice of every person who had ever looked at her and seen limitation instead of capability, and she felt, for exactly 30 seconds, the full weight of all of them at once. 30 seconds. Then she crouched down, took out her notebook and pencil from her apron pocket, and wrote. Batch 1 soap did not cure, likely cause lye concentration insufficient. Secondary possibility, temperature too low during curing. Adjustments required, increase lye strength, insulate molds better, extend cure time. Begin batch 2. She stood up. She went inside and put water on for coffee. She sat at the kitchen table and worked through the problem the same way she worked through a stubborn laundry stain, methodically, without emotion, because emotion didn't get stains out and it didn't fix soap chemistry either. She thought about her grandmother, not for comfort, for information. Watch what's happening. There's a difference. What had happened was the lye hadn't been strong enough to fully convert the fat. The saponification had started and stalled, which meant she needed stronger lye water, more ash, slower filtration, longer collection time. She started collecting ash again that same afternoon. By the time Friday came around and she went back to Bellamy's for her next pails, word had already gotten around about the failed batch. She knew this because of the particular quality of the silence that greeted her on the street, the kind of silence that means people have been talking and have just stopped. Two women outside the dry goods store. One of them, Alice Pratt, the Reverend's wife, had the careful, contained expression of someone choosing her words. "Clara," she said. "Mrs. Pratt, I heard your soap experiment didn't quite." She paused delicately. "First batch failed," Clara said. "I'm adjusting the formula." Alice Pratt blinked. She had clearly been prepared for something more: embarrassment, deflection, maybe an announcement that Clara was abandoning the whole idea. The flat admission caught her sideways. "Oh," she said. "Well, I hope it goes better." "It will," Clara said, and kept walking. Bellamy was almost disappointed when she showed up again. "Figured I might not see you this week," he said, moving aside to let her access the barrels. "Why wouldn't you? Heard the first batch didn't work out." "It didn't." She began loading. "That's why I'm making another one." He watched her for a moment. "You know, most people." "I'm not most people, Mr. Bellamy." He went quiet. There was something in her voice that particular morning, not anger, not bravado, nothing he could have pointed to and called out, but something underneath that made him decide not to finish the sentence. He went back inside. She loaded her cart and left. Caleb Foster wasn't outside the barber shop that morning, but his wife Ruth was at the window of the feed store as Clara passed. Clara saw her looking. Clara nodded. Ruth Foster looked away. The second batch failed too. This time it was better. The soap set on the outside, hardened to a reasonable firmness on the surface, but when she cut into it with her knife, the center was still soft, still greasy, the chemistry incomplete. Closer, not close enough. She sat with that for one evening. One evening of genuine doubt, the real kind, not the performed kind, not the kind you perform for an audience or for yourself to prove you're taking things seriously. The real kind that comes at 10 o'clock at night when you're tired and cold, and the numbers say you've now spent 7 weeks and more money than you could afford on something that still hasn't worked. She let herself feel it. All of it. She thought about the laundry she'd be doing tomorrow regardless. The 11 families. The same route she'd walked for 4 years. The same calculations that always came up short. She thought about what it would mean to stop. Nothing would change, she realized. If she stopped, nothing would change. Not the laundry. Not the numbers. Not the way Caleb Foster's voice carried across the street. Not the careful, contained sympathy in Alice Pratt's face. Nothing would change, whereas if she kept going. She opened her notebook. Batch 2. Surface set, center soft. Lye concentration improved, but temperature during saponification still too variable. Solution: maintain heat source closer to mixing vessel during process. Build small windbreak around fire to prevent heat loss. Reduce batch size for more even curing. Batch 3. Smaller molds, better insulation, tighter temperature control. She closed the notebook and went to bed. She built the windbreak the next morning, before her first laundry delivery. She found smaller molds, old tin bread pans she'd had sitting unused in the kitchen, and lined them carefully. She adjusted her fire management so the heat stayed consistent throughout the mixing process. She added something else, too. A small handful of dried lavender from the bundle hanging over her kitchen window. Her grandmother had always added something: honey, oats, dried herbs, and for years Clara had thought of it as decoration, the kind of personal touch that didn't matter to the chemistry. She understood now that she'd been wrong. It wasn't decoration. It was intention. It was the maker saying, "I thought about the person who would use this. I made this for someone, not just for the process." That difference was in the soap. You couldn't measure it, and you couldn't leave it out. She mixed the third batch on a Tuesday morning, maintained the temperature with obsessive care for 3 full hours, poured into the small tin molds, insulated them with folded blankets, and put them in the warmest corner of her back room. She waited 6 days. She would not look until Saturday. She told herself this and meant it. She delivered laundry. She collected payment. She stopped by Caldwell's for salt and heard Everett Caldwell behind the counter telling someone that he'd heard Clara Holloway was still at it with her soap business, which he said with exactly the kind of amused tolerance you'd extend to a child insisting they could fly. She said good morning to Everett Caldwell. She paid for her salt. She went home. Saturday morning arrived, 5:54 a.m. Still dark, the first thin gray beginning at the eastern edge of the sky. Clara lit her lamp and walked to the back room. She pressed one finger against the corner of the nearest tin mold, and the surface held firm under her finger like something solid. Like something real, she pressed harder, still firm. She worked her fingers around the edge of the tin, turned it, tapped the bottom the way her grandmother had shown her, and the bar came out clean and whole and solid, pale gold in the lamplight. The dried lavender visible throughout like small purple stars. She held it with both hands. She brought it close and breathed. It smelled like her grandmother's kitchen, like work that meant something, like something her grandmother would have held and nodded at and said nothing about, because there was nothing to say the thing either worked or it didn't, and this one worked. She worked up a lather at the basin. Rich, smooth, real lather. The kind that didn't dissolve the moment you rinsed it. The kind that left your hands feeling clean and soft rather than stripped and tight. She stood in the dark of her back room and held the finished bar of soap and let herself have the moment without outrushing it, because she had earned it, and she knew she had earned it, and there was nobody there to tell her differently. Then she went to the kitchen, started coffee, opened her notebook, and wrote. Batch 3 success, complete. Cure throughout. Lather strong and smooth. Gentle on skin, scent mild and clean. Production cost per bar calculated below. Ready to test with a real user. Identify first recipient carefully. She drank her coffee. She thought about who. She needed someone who would tell her the plain truth, not kindness, not cruelty, just accuracy. Someone whose opinion the rest of the town would listen to, because it would matter whether the first endorsement came from someone credible. She thought about it for 20 minutes. Then she wrapped 6 bars in clean cloth, tied them with brown string, put on her coat, and walked to Martha Whitmore's house. Martha Whitmore had raised 6 children in Willow Creek and outlasted a difficult husband, 2 brutal winters, and a lawsuit over property rights that she'd handled without a lawyer and won. She was 53 years old, had extraordinary standards in everything, and was constitutionally incapable of dishonesty even when honesty was inconvenient. Clara knocked at 9 in the morning. Martha answered in her apron, looked at Clara, looked at the wrapped bundle, and said nothing for a moment. "You made it work," Martha said. It was not a question. "I believe so," Clara said. "I'd like you to tell me if I'm wrong." Martha looked at her steadily. Then she stepped back from the door. "Come in." Clara came in. Martha went directly to the kitchen basin without ceremony, unwrapped 1 bar, and began washing her hands with the focus of a woman conducting an inspection. She worked up the lather. She rinsed, she examined her hands front and back. She turned the bar over twice, pressed it, smelled it. The kitchen was quiet. "Where'd you learn to make soap?" Martha asked. "My grandmother, farm soap," Martha said. Not a question. "Yes, ma'am." Martha set the bar on the edge of the pizza basin and looked at Clara with those direct, assessing eyes that had never once said something they didn't mean. It's better than what Everett Caldwell is selling, she said. Considerably better, and I suspect it costs less. Quite a bit less. How much a bar? Clara named the price. Martha reached into her apron pocket without a word, counted out the coins and set them on the counter. I'll take all 6, she said. Clara looked at the coins. 6 bars. More money than she'd made from 3 full laundry loads last week. Thank you, Martha. Don't thank me, Martha said, already turning back to her kitchen. I'm not doing you a favor. I'm buying soap that works. There's a difference. Clara picked up the coins and put them in her pocket. She walked back through Willow Creek on a Saturday morning in late September, and the town looked exactly the same as it always had. Same dust on the main street, same men outside the barber shop, same smell of bread from the bakery, same weathered storefronts, same sky. Everything the same. Except inside her apron pocket was the weight of 6 coins that hadn't been there an hour ago, and inside her chest was something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Not hope. Something harder than hope. Certainty. She went home, opened her notebook, and at the bottom of the page, in her careful straight handwriting, she wrote 3 words. This is working. She closed the notebook. She started a new batch. Martha Whitmore did not keep secrets well, not because she was a gossip, but because when she believed in something, she said so, plainly and without apology, and she didn't much care who was listening. By Monday morning, 4 women had stopped by Clara's house. Not to buy yet, to look. They stood on her front porch with the careful, assessing posture of women who had been told something they weren't sure they believed, and Clara brought out 2 bars and let them hold them and smell them and ask questions. And she answered every question straight, because straight answers were the only kind she had ever trusted. How much? Asked Vera Dunning, who did laundry for the hotel and had the roughest hands Clara had ever seen on a woman her age. Clara told her. Vera looked at the bar in her hand. Looked at Clara. That's less than half what Caldwell charges. Yes, ma'am. Why? Because I don't have his overhead, Clara said. And because I'm not shipping it from back east. Vera turned the bar over once more. Pressed her thumb against it. I'll take 4. The second woman, younger, maybe 25, the wife of one of the miners, said she'd have to ask her husband first, which meant no, and Clara didn't push. The third woman bought 2 bars and left without saying much. The fourth woman, Agnes Hollenbeck, who had not said a single word the entire time, bought 6 bars, put them in her basket, and said on her way out the door, I'll tell my sister in Denver. Clara stood on her porch after they left and looked at the coins in her palm. 22 bars sold in 4 days. She went inside and opened her notebook and did the arithmetic. Then she did it again, because she didn't trust it the first time. The numbers were real, the margin was real, and she was already nearly out of product. She went to Bellamy's the next morning, without waiting for Tuesday. Thomas Bellamy was behind his counter, breaking down a slice of beef when the door opened, and Clara walked in, and he looked up with that familiar mix of amusement and mild bewilderment that had become his standard expression when dealing with her. It's Monday, he said. I need more pails. He set down his cleaver. You're out already? I need to increase my volume. I'd like to come daily instead of twice a week, and I'd like to negotiate a different rate for larger quantities. He stared at her daily. Starting tomorrow, Miss Holloway. He wiped his hands on his apron. What in the world is happening over at your place? I'm making soap, Clara said, and people are buying it. He looked at her for a long moment, with an expression she couldn't quite read. Not mockery, not exactly. Something more complicated. Something that might have been the early stages of recalibration, a man realizing that the thing he'd found funny 2 weeks ago had turned into something else while he wasn't paying attention. Daily, he said again, slower this time. And what rate were you thinking? 1.5 cents per pail for daily collection. I'm saving you the removal cost every single day instead of twice a week. That's worth something to you. He chewed on that. 1.5, he said. 1.5, Clara confirmed. He picked up his cleaver again, turned back to his work, and said without looking at her, "Fine. Come tomorrow at 6. She was at his back door at 5:58. The expansion changed everything about her days and nothing about her discipline. She still did laundry for her 11 families. She was not about to give up reliable income for something that hadn't yet proven itself reliable, which meant her hours stretched from 4 in the morning to 9 or 10 at night. A pace that would have broken most people, and that Clara accepted without complaint because she had been working at that pace for years anyway. What changed was the shape of the work. She was no longer experimenting. She knew the formula now, knew it the way she knew her own handwriting, and she could reproduce it consistently, batch after batch, with a precision her grandmother would have recognized as craftsmanship. She started adding variations. Plain soap for laundry, strong, economical, built for heavy use. Lavender for personal washing, gentler, mild-scented, the kind women would choose for themselves when they had the option. A third variety with oatmeal worked into the mixture for women with dry or sensitive skin, which she'd read about in an old almanac and tested carefully before offering it. 3 varieties, different prices, different uses. She recorded everything, and then Caleb Foster walked through her front gate on a Wednesday afternoon, and Clara nearly dropped the pail she was carrying. He came alone, which surprised her. Caleb Foster did almost nothing alone. His commentary required an audience the way a fire required oxygen, and without one he seemed somehow smaller, still sharp-jawed, still carrying himself like a man whose opinions had always been welcomed, but quieter. And something in the set of his shoulders said this visit had cost him something. Clara set down the pail and waited. "Miss Holloway," he said. "Mr. Foster." He stopped a few feet from her and looked at the ground for a moment, then back up. "Ruth sent me, his wife." Clara waited. "She's been using your soap," Caleb said. "The lavender kind. She bought it from Martha Whitmore last week. Didn't tell me." He stopped. "Her hands. She's had trouble with her hands for years, the skin cracking, especially in winter." She said. He stopped again, started over. She said it's the first soap she's used that doesn't make it worse. Clara said nothing. Caleb reached into his coat pocket and produced a small folded paper. He held it out. She wrote down what she wants. 4 lavender, 2 of the plain. And she wanted to know if you'd be willing to deliver regular, once a week. Clara took the paper. She opened it. Ruth Foster's handwriting was neat and careful, a woman who took her time with things. "Tell your wife the delivery's no trouble," Clara said. "Price?" Clara told him. He reached into his pocket and paid it without negotiating, which Clara suspected was the most uncomfortable thing Caleb Foster had done in several years. He was halfway back through the gate when Clara said, "Mr. Foster," he turned. "Tell Ruth I'll add a small oatmeal bar at no charge. She might find it useful for the winter." He looked at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before. Not apology, she didn't expect that, didn't need it. Something simpler, acknowledgement. The plain, undecorated recognition that he had been wrong about something. He nodded once and left. Clara watched the gate close behind. Then she went back to work. By the 3rd week of October she had a list. Not a mental list, a written list in her notebook of customers who had placed standing weekly orders, women who wanted the same bars delivered every Monday or Thursday, without having to come to her door and ask. The list had 11 names on it by the end of that week. 11 names, the same number as her laundry families. She sat with that for a moment. Then she wrote, "Hire help. Production cannot scale without additional hands." She thought about who, and she thought about it carefully, because this decision mattered more than almost any production decision she'd made. She needed someone reliable and strong and willing to learn, and most importantly, someone who understood that what they'd be entering was not charity. It was work, real work, paid fairly. She thought about June Alcott. June was 28, a widow since the previous spring, living with her mother-in-law in a house that was not large enough for 2 women, who had never much liked each other. She had 2 children under 5 and had spent the last 6 months taking in mending at rates so low they barely covered the thread. Clara had seen her twice at Caldwell's store, adding up coins on the counter with that particular careful focus of someone who was very close to not having enough. She went to June's door on a Thursday morning. June answered looking like she hadn't slept, which was probably accurate, with a baby on her hip and flower on her sleeve, and she looked at Clara with the wary expression of someone who had learned to be careful about what she hoped for. "Miss Holloway," she said. "Mrs. Alcott, I'd like to offer you work if you're interested. Real work, steady hours, fair pay. I need a second pair of hands in my soap operation starting next week." June blinked. The baby grabbed a fistful of her hair. "Soap," she said. "Yes, ma'am. I'll teach you everything. The hours are 5 to 9 in the morning, 6 days a week, and I'll pay—" She named a figure that was higher than June's mending income by a considerable margin. June was quiet for a moment. "Why me?" she asked, not suspicious, genuinely asking. "Because you work hard and you need steady income, and I need someone I can trust to show up," Clara said. "I don't know of a reason to look further than that." June shifted the baby to her other hip. "When do I start?" "Monday, 5 o'clock, dress for mess." June almost smiled. "All right, Miss Holloway." Clara said. "Call me Clara." June Alcott arrived Monday at 4:57, and Clara liked her immediately for that. She was a fast learner and a harder worker than Clara had expected, which was saying something because Clara's expectations were not low. Within a week, June could manage the rendering process without supervision. Within 2 weeks, she had the lye preparation down, well enough that Clara could leave her to it and focus on the mix and pouring. They worked in a rhythm that developed naturally, without much need for discussion, the way good working partnerships do. The production doubled, and then on a Friday morning in the second week of November, Everett Caldwell came to Clara's door. She had been expecting this. She hadn't known exactly when, but she'd known it was coming. Had known it from the moment Agnes Hollenbeck walked off her porch with 6 bars and mentioned her sister in Denver. Had known it from the growing list of weekly orders. Had known it from the way Caldwell had looked at her in his store last week with that particular expression of a man recalculating something he'd gotten wrong. He was a careful man. He would have taken his time. He would have done his own version of research, asked his customers, watched the numbers, waited until he was sure before he moved. But he was here now, at her door, in his good coat, hat in hand. Clara opened the door before he knocked a second time. "Mr. Caldwell," she said. "Miss Holloway." He looked past her briefly, taking in what he could see of the operation behind her, the curing racks visible through the back room door, the organized rows of finished bars, the smell of lavender and clean tallow. "I wonder if I might have a few minutes of your time." "Come in." She did not offer coffee. This was not a social call, and both of them knew it. She sat at her kitchen table, with her hands folded, and waited, and Everett Caldwell sat across from her and looked at her, the way businessmen look at something they've underestimated. "I've been hearing about your soap from a number of my customers," he said. "I know. They're asking me why I don't carry it." "I know that too." He looked at her steadily. He was a man of about 50, lean and precise, with the careful manner of someone who had built something from careful decisions over many years, and valued that carefulness more than almost anything else. He was not unkind. He was simply a man who had operated within a certain understanding of how things worked, and that understanding had not previously included Clara May Holloway. "I'd like to discuss stocking your soap in my store," he said. Clara looked at him without speaking for a moment. "On what terms?" she said. He proposed terms. She listened without interrupting, and when he finished she said no. He blinked. "No, your margin is too high and mine is too low." "I'm not running a charity operation, Mr. Caldwell. If I'm producing the goods and you're selling them, we split the margin more evenly than what you just proposed." "Miss Holloway, that's how it works with me," Clara said. "Or it doesn't work at all. I have 12 standing delivery customers right now, and that number will be 15 by end of next week. I don't need your shelves, but I think you might be needing my product. He looked at her. The kitchen was very quiet. You've done this before, he said finally. Negotiated? I've kept my own accounts for 11 years, Mr. Caldwell. I know what things cost and what they're worth. Those aren't always the same number. He looked down at his hat, then back up. Your terms, he said. What exactly? She told him. He counter-proposed. She adjusted 2 points and held firm on the third, which was the one that mattered. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might walk out, and she kept her face neutral and her hands still and waited, because she had learned that waiting was sometimes the most powerful thing a person could do in a room. All right, he said, your third point stands good. Clara stood and extended her hand. He shook it firmly, without hesitation, the handshake of a man who knew when he'd met his match, and had the sense to respect it rather than resent it. I'll need 12 bars of each variety by next Monday to start, he said. Can you manage that? I'll have 15 of each ready by Saturday, Clara said. So you have time to arrange the display. He left with his hat back on his head, and something new in his expression that Clara recognized, though she'd seen it rarely enough in her life that it still cost her a moment to name it. He respected her. Not liked, not pitied, not tolerated. Respected. She closed the door and stood in her kitchen for exactly 30 seconds, letting that land. Then she went to the back room and told June they needed to increase production again, and June said, How much? And Clara said, 15 of each by Saturday, and June said, Lord have mercy, and then went back to work without another word, which was one of the many things Clara had come to appreciate about June Alcott. The bars were on Caldwell's shelves by Saturday afternoon. Clara walked past the window that evening on her way home from a delivery and stopped for a moment, looking in through the glass. She could see 3 of her bars arranged on the near shelf, the brown string ties visible, the small handwritten card she'd made, identifying each variety. A woman was in the store. Clara watched her stop in front of the shelf. Pick up the lavender bar, smell it, read the card. Look at the price, put it in her basket. Clara walked home. She did not run. She did not allow herself anything dramatic. She walked home at her normal pace, put her coat on the hook, started water for coffee, and sat down at her kitchen table with her notebook. She looked at the numbers. Then she looked at them again. Then she wrote, at the bottom of the page, below the production figures and the cost calculations and the margin analysis, Caldwell's General Store, first shipment delivered. 45 bars, Saturday. And then, because it was true and because she had earned the right to write it, it's not enough. Keep going. She kept going. The weeks that followed had the quality of something gathering momentum, slow at first, visible only if you were paying attention, and then suddenly undeniable. Caldwell sold out of her first shipment in 4 days. He sent his store boy to her door on Wednesday morning with an order for twice the quantity. Twice, Clara read the order slip, looked at June across the work table. June looked back at her. We're going to need another woman, June said. I know, Clara said. I have a neighbor. Her name's Frances. She's strong, and she needs work, and she doesn't complain. Can she start Friday? I'll ask her today. Frances started Friday. She was quiet and methodical and had the best sense of temperature control. Of the 3 of them, she could hold her hand over the mixing pot and tell within a few degrees how hot the mixture was, which saved them guesswork and improved consistency. By the end of November, Clara had 3 women working alongside her every morning, a standing weekly order from Caldwell's that had tripled since the first shipment, and a waiting list of individual customers. A waiting list. She had written those words and then stared at them because they seemed like words that belonged to a different person's life. And that was when Henry Moss came to see her. Henry ran the grain mill and was a quiet man, not given to Caleb Foster's easy commentary, someone Clara had always respected without particularly liking, because respect and liking were not the same thing, and she'd never confused them. He came on a Tuesday evening, knocked on her front door, and when she answered, he was holding a piece of paper. "I had a letter," he said, "from my brother-in-law in Pueblo. He runs a dry goods store. He heard about your soap from a traveling merchant who came through last week." He held out the paper. "He wants to know if you can supply him." Clara took the paper. She read it twice. Pueblo was 40 miles away. "He says he can move 30 bars a week minimum," Henry said. "Maybe more once it gets established." Clara looked up from the paper. "How'd a merchant in Pueblo hear about soap made in Willow Creek?" she asked. "Agnes Hollenbeck's sister," Henry said. "Apparently she told someone, who told someone else, who told the merchant on his way through." Agnes Hollenbeck's sister in Denver. Clara thought about Agnes standing on her porch 6 weeks ago, putting 6 bars in her basket, mentioning her sister as she walked out the gate. She had noted it at the time, and then moved on to the next thing, because there was always a next thing. But that offhand comment, that casual, neighborly mention of a sister in another city, had just arrived back at her door in the form of a letter from Pueblo. She looked at Henry Moss. "Tell your brother-in-law yes," she said. "I'll write him terms by end of week." Henry nodded. "I thought you would," he said, and there was something in his voice, simple, unadorned acknowledgement that landed differently than the effusive compliments of people who'd been skeptical and were now overcorrecting. Henry Moss wasn't overcorrecting. He was just a man stating plainly what he observed. "You built something real," he said. "I reckon people are starting to notice." She closed the door. She stood in her front hall and looked at the letter from Pueblo. 40 miles away. She thought about those barrels behind Bellamy's shop. She thought about Caleb Foster's voice carrying across the street on a Tuesday morning while she kept walking. She thought about her notebook and her grandmother and 3 failed batches, and Martha Whitmore saying, "I'll take all 6," with the matter-of-fact tone of a woman who was simply doing business. She thought about the weight of the coins in her apron pocket that first Saturday morning. Then she put the Pueblo letter in her notebook, between 2 pages so it wouldn't crease, and went to start the next day's production figures. There was still a great deal of work to do, and Clara May Holloway had never once in her life been afraid of work. The letter from Pueblo was only the beginning. Clara had not fully understood that, yet when she wrote back to Henry Moss's brother-in-law with her terms clean, straightforward terms, the same structure she'd negotiated with Caldwell, adjusted for distance and volume. She sealed the envelope, gave it to the post, and went back to her production table. She thought it was one store in one town 40 miles away. She did not yet understand that Agnes Hollenbeck's sister had a wide social circle, that traveling merchants talked to each other the way rivers connected to rivers. That a good product in the West in 1876 moved faster than almost any other kind of news, because people out here were hungry for things that actually worked. She found out 3 weeks later when 2 letters arrived on the same day. One from a dry goods merchant in Colorado Springs. One from a general store in Trinidad. She stood at her kitchen table with both letters open and read them twice each, and then she sat down because her legs had decided they needed a moment. June came in from the back room with her sleeves rolled up and flour lye residue on her forearms, and she looked at Clara, sitting at the table with 2 letters, and said, "What happened?" Clara handed her both letters without speaking. "June, read them." Her eyes went wide. "Colorado Springs," she said, "in Trinidad." "That's Clara. I know," Clara said. "Can we fill those orders?" Clara looked at the back room, looked at her notebook. Did the arithmetic in her head the way she always did, fast and without mercy, not rounding anything in her favor. "Not yet," she said. "We need more space and 1 more woman at minimum. 2 would be better. My cousin Delia just came into town," June said immediately. "She's been looking for work since she got here. Strong as a mule and twice as stubborn." "Bring her tomorrow," Clara said. June was already untying her apron. "I'll bring her today." Delia arrived that same afternoon, a tall woman of 35 with the kind of quiet competence that showed itself immediately in the way she looked around the workspace, asked 2 precise questions. and then simply started doing the thing that obviously needed doing without being told. Clara hired her on the spot. She wrote back to Colorado Springs and Trinidad the same evening. Yes. Terms enclosed. First shipment within 3 weeks. Then she went to see about the space problem. The space problem was significant. Her backyard operation had reached its physical limit. She was producing at maximum capacity for the setup she had, and maximum capacity was no longer enough. She needed a proper workspace, a building with a real fire pit and ventilation, room for multiple mixing stations, storage for curing inventory, and space to grow. She had one option that made sense financially. The old tannery building on the south edge of town had been empty for 2 years, since Horace Webb closed up and moved to Denver. It was a solid structure. Webb had built it to last, and it had exactly the kind of industrial fire pit and ventilation she needed, because tanning and soap making had similar requirements in terms of heat management and airflow. The problem was that it belonged to Gerald Finch. Gerald Finch owned more of Willow Creek than most people realized. The tannery building, 3 vacant lots, the warehouse behind the feed store, and 2 residential properties he rented out at the upper edge of what the market would bear. He was 60 years old, thin and precise, and he had a reputation for 2 things: shrewdness in real estate matters, and a deep, abiding belief that women in business were either a temporary curiosity or a reliable source of entertainment. Clara had known this going in. She went to see him on a Thursday morning at his office above the hardware store. His clerk, a young man named Peters, looked up when she walked in and blinked in the particular way young men blink, when they are trying to figure out what category to put something in. "I'm here to see Mr. Finch," Clara said. "Do you have an appointment?" "No. Tell him Clara Holloway would like 5 minutes of his time to discuss a business lease." Peters disappeared. He was gone long enough that Clara had time to look around the office, note the property ledgers on the shelves, and recognize 2 of the addresses as ones she walked past every week. He came back and said, with audible surprise, "He'll see you." Gerald Finch was behind a large desk covered in papers, and he looked at Clara the way a man looks at something unexpected that has wandered into his office, not hostile, not welcoming, purely assessing. "Miss Holloway," he said. "Sit down." She sat. "You make soap," he said. "I do. The soap Everett Caldwell is selling. Among other retailers, yes." His eyebrows moved slightly. "Other retailers. Colorado Springs and Trinidad have placed orders. I'm in discussion with 2 additional merchants." This was true in the sense that she intended to initiate those discussions, which she considered close enough to accurate for the purposes of this conversation. "I need the Webb Tannery building. I'd like to discuss lease terms." Finch leaned back in his chair and looked at her over his desk with the half-smile of a man who found the situation amusing and was not trying to hide it. "That building," he said, "is a significant property." "I know. I've looked at it carefully. It would require a substantial monthly payment." "Name a figure." He named one. It was too high. Clara had known he'd open high. This was how Finch operated with everyone, testing to see what they'd accept before settling into negotiation. "That's not a lease figure," Clara said. "That's a purchase installment." "I'll offer you this." She named her figure. He shook his head slowly, still with that smile. "Miss Holloway, I don't think you understand the market for commercial properties." "I understand you've had that building empty for 2 years," Clara said. "I understand you're paying taxes on it with no income coming in. I understand that a steady monthly lease from a growing business is worth considerably more to you right now than an empty building you can't find another tenant for. I'm not asking you to do me a favor. I'm offering you a solution to a problem you have." The smile changed. Not gone, but different. He looked at her more carefully than he had been. They negotiated for 20 minutes. Clara got the building at a number between her opening offer and his closer to hers than his, which she considered a success. The lease was for 1 year with an option to renew. She signed the paper with Finch's pen, shook his hand, and walked out of his office feeling the particular satisfaction of a woman who has just won a fight she was not supposed to win. Peters stared at her on the way out. She gave him a pleasant nod and went down the stairs. The move to the tannery building took a week. It was the hardest week of physical work Clara had done since she'd started the whole enterprise, moving equipment, rebuilding the production setup in a larger space, reconfiguring the curing racks, teaching June and Delia and Francis the new workflow in the new space, while simultaneously filling existing orders and not letting a single delivery fall late. Nothing fell late. By the end of the week, the production capacity had doubled again, and Clara could see clearly, in the numbers, not as wishful thinking but as arithmetic, that the space they now had would support the growth she was projecting for the next 6 months without requiring another move. She stood in the middle of the tannery building on a Friday evening after June, and Delia and Francis had gone home, looked at the curing racks with their rows of finished bars, and breathed. Just breathed. Then she went home and slept for 9 hours straight, which was the most sleep she'd had in 3 months. She woke to Caleb Foster standing on her front porch. She had not been expecting him. It was early, barely past 6, and Caleb Foster was not an early riser. He was standing with his hat in his hands and an expression on his face that she recognized from his last visit, the expression of a man delivering something from someone else because the someone else had decided it was his job to deliver it. "Ruth again?" Clara asked through the door. "No," he said. "This one's mine." She opened the door fully and waited. Caleb looked at his hat for a moment, then up at her. "I've been talking to some of the other merchants. Couple of the men on the town council. They're interested in whether you'd consider whether your business might if there was a formal arrangement." He stopped. Started over. "There's talk about a town market day. Monthly. Merchants setting up in the square. Some of the council think having your soap operation represented would draw people in from the surrounding ranches." Clara looked at him. "They want me at their market day," she said. "Yes, ma'am. The same market day that Everett Caldwell and Thomas Bellamy and the rest of them run." "Yes, ma'am. The same town square where you called out from across the street that a woman my size should be hauling something worth hauling." Caleb's jaw tightened. He looked at his hat again. "Yes, ma'am," he said, quieter. Clara let that sit for a moment. Not out of cruelty, out of the simple human need to let truth occupy the space it had earned. "Tell the council I'll consider it," she said. "I'll let you know by end of week." He nodded, started to turn stop. "Clara," he said, and it was the first time Caleb Foster had ever called her by her first name, which was not lost on either of them. "For what it's worth, what you've built is something. I was wrong about it. I was wrong about you." She looked at him standing on her porch with his hat in his hands, this man who had made her walk faster for years, because stopping to answer him wasn't worth the cost, and she felt not satisfaction, not triumph. Nothing so simple as that. She felt the quiet, complicated weight of what it meant when the world finally catches up to what you already knew about yourself. "I know you were," she said. "Not hard, not soft, just true." He left. Clara closed the door and stood in her front hall for a moment, and then she went to start her morning. She was 3 hours into production. June and Delia working the mixing stations, Francis managing the curing racks, Clara doing the supply inventory when the door to the tannery building opened, and a man walked in that she had never seen before. He was tall, mid-40s, wearing a good coat that was dusty from travel, with the kind of bearing that said he was accustomed to being the most purposeful person in whatever room he walked into. He looked around the workspace with quick, precise eyes, not impressed exactly, but engaged, the way someone looks when they're seeing something that aligns with information they already have. He spotted Clara and came directly toward her. "Miss Holloway," he said. "My name is George Alderman. I represent a wholesale distribution company out of Denver. We supply general merchandise to retailers across Colorado and New Mexico territory. I've been hearing about your product from 3 different merchants in the last 2 weeks, and I'd like to talk to you about a supply arrangement." The building went quiet in the way buildings go quiet when everyone in them realizes something important is happening. Clara looked at him. "How'd you find me?" she said. Henry Moss's brother-in-law in Pueblo wrote to one of our buyers. Our buyer wrote to me, I was in Pueblo 2 days ago and I came straight here. He paused. That's how good the word is, Miss Holloway. She looked at him for a moment longer. Then she said, June, hold the batch a trace. Don't pour yet. She looked back at Alderman. My office is in the back. Her office was a wooden table and 2 chairs in the rear corner of the building, which was not impressive but was functional, and Clara had long since stopped apologizing for functional things. She sat, he sat. He put a leather satchel on the table and pulled out papers. I'll be direct, he said. We want to add your soap to our distribution catalog. That means we purchase from you at wholesale, we mark it up, we sell it to retailers throughout our network. You don't have to manage individual store relationships, you deal only with us. In exchange, your product reaches significantly more markets than you can access independently. Clara looked at the papers he'd laid out. How many retailers in your network? She asked. 47 currently in Colorado, 18 in New Mexico territory. We're expanding into Kansas next year, 47. She kept her face neutral. Volume commitment, she said. He named a number. It was larger than her current monthly production by a factor of 4. That's a significant volume, she said. We understand you'd need time to scale. We're prepared to work with a phased schedule, smaller initial volumes with graduated increases over 6 months. And the wholesale price, he named it. Clara looked at the number and did the arithmetic instantly in her head, the way she always did, and the arithmetic said this was a fair number, not generous, not exploitative. Fair, and that at the volume he was describing, fair was more than enough. I'll need to see your retailer list, she said. I want to know where my product is going. He slid another sheet across the table without hesitation. A man who had expected that question. She read the list. 47 stores. She recognized several of the town names, had passed through a few of them years ago on different business, could picture the kind of establishments they ran. The terms of exclusivity, said. He paused. We'd prefer. No exclusivity, Clara said. I keep my existing retail relationships. Your arrangement adds to my distribution. It doesn't replace or restrict it. He leaned back slightly. That's not our standard arrangement. I understand, it's my standard arrangement. She folded her hands on the table. Mr. Alderman, you came to me, which means your buyers want my product specifically, and they want it enough to send you here from Denver. I'm not going to give up the control I've built in exchange for volume. I'll give you volume in exchange for fair terms. Those are not the same thing. He looked at her across the table. The building was still quiet. Clara was aware of June and Delia and Francis on the other side of the room, trying very hard to look like they were doing something other than listening. No exclusivity, Alderman said slowly, testing the shape of it. You keep existing accounts, yes, and you guarantee the phased volume on the schedule we've outlined. Contingent on the phased schedule being realistic, which I'll need to verify against my production capacity. If the schedule is reasonable, yes. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he picked up his pen and made a notation on the paper in front of him. All right, he said, no exclusivity. Existing accounts remain yours. We'll need to revisit the wholesale price upward by 2 points to compensate for the arrangement. 1 point, Clara said. 1.5. Done, Clara said. He extended his hand. She shook it. George Alderman left 40 minutes later with a signed letter of intent in his satchel and the slightly dazed expression of a man who had come expecting to conduct a negotiation and had instead participated in one. Clara watched him ride out. Then she turned around. June was standing 5 feet away with her hands pressed together and her eyes bright. Did that just happen? June said. Denver, June said. A Denver distributor. Yes, Clara. June's voice cracked slightly on the name. A year ago I was counting pennies for thread. Clara looked at her. At Delia, who had set down what she was doing and was standing very still. at Frances, who was gripping the edge of a curing rack with both hands. These three women. Who had shown up? Who had learned? Who had worked at 5 in the morning in the cold because someone had offered them a fair wage and the dignity of real work. "Don't stop counting yet," Clara said. "We have a production schedule to build." But she said it with something in her voice that hadn't been there before. And all three of them heard it. They went back to work, but the energy in the building had shifted, the way air shifts before a storm, charged with something that was the opposite of danger. Clara pulled out her notebook and started writing the production numbers, the new targets, the phased schedule, the staffing implications. The arithmetic was staggering. Not unmanageable, she could see the path, each step logical and achievable, but staggering in the distance between where she was now and where the path went. She wrote for 2 hours straight, stopping only to check a measurement or answer a question from the floor. And at the end of 2 hours, she had a 6-month plan that was the most ambitious thing she had ever put on paper. She looked at it. She thought about the barrel of rotten fat behind Bellamy's shop. She thought about Caleb Foster's voice carrying across the street. She thought about sitting at her kitchen table at 10 o'clock at night with her pencil in her hand, not writing "this won't work," not writing "maybe they're right," writing instead "first mistake discovered." She thought about her grandmother's hands. Then she closed the notebook, stood up, and told June to pull the next batch. They had work to do, and it was 3 days later, on a Tuesday morning, when the thing happened that nearly destroyed everything. She came in earlier than usual, before 5, because she wanted to review the new production schedule before the others arrived. She unlocked the tannery building, went inside, lit the lamp, and stopped. Something was wrong. She could feel it before she saw it, that particular quality of wrongness that comes when something in a space you know intimately has been disturbed. She held the lamp up and looked around. The curing racks were untouched. The mixing stations were as she'd left them. The supply stores looked. She crossed to the supply shelves. The lye containers were open. All 5 of them. Open, and not just open tampered with. She could see immediately from the surface that something had been added to the containers. The consistency was wrong, the color was slightly off. She brought the lamp close and looked carefully, and her stomach dropped. Water. Someone had added water to her lye supply. Enough water to significantly dilute the concentration. Enough to ruin any batch made from it, without the maker knowing, until it failed to cure, which meant days of production. Dozens of bars. A significant order already promised, all of it soft and greasy and worthless. The way her first batch had been worthless. Except this wasn't an accident. She straightened up. She looked around the building carefully, the door, the windows, the latch on the back entrance, and she saw it then, the back latch, the scratch marks around the plate where someone had worked a tool into the gap and forced it. Someone had broken in. Someone had broken in and deliberately sabotaged her lye supply and left everything else untouched so that the damage would not be obvious, so that she would use the compromised materials without knowing. Run through days of production and a significant portion of her Denver order, and only discover the problem when the bars failed to cure. Whoever did this knew enough about soap making to know exactly where to strike. Clara stood in the middle of her building with the lamp in her hand and felt not panic, not grief, nothing so soft as either of those. She felt a cold, focused fury that was completely different from the doubt and exhaustion she'd felt after her first batches failed. Because this was not failure. This was an attack. And attacks told you something that accidents didn't. Attacks told you that someone was afraid of what you were building. She set the lamp down on the table. She took out her notebook. She wrote down exactly what she observed: the open containers, the water addition, the forced back latch, the time she arrived, everything in her careful straight handwriting. Because documentation was the first thing you did when something was done to you that you intended to answer for. Then she went to get the sheriff. Sheriff Dale Pruffitt was a man who believed in evidence the way a carpenter believed in level surfaces, not because it was poetic, but because everything else was guesswork, and guesswork got people hurt. He was at Clara's tannery building within 20 minutes of her knock on his door, moving through the space with the quiet, methodical attention of someone who had learned long ago that the first 5 minutes at a scene told you more than the next 5 hours of asking questions. He looked at the containers, looked at the back latch, crouched down and examined the scratch marks without touching them. Stood up. "You didn't notice anything last night when you locked up," he said. "Everything was normal when I left at 7, Clara said. "I was the last one out. And you came in this morning at what time?" 4:40. He looked at the scratch marks again. "Somebody knew what they were doing," he said. "This wasn't random. They didn't take anything, didn't break anything they didn't have to. They came in, did one specific thing and left." "Yes," Clara said. "That's exactly right." Pruitt looked at her. He was a careful man, not given to assumptions, which was part of why Clara had gone to him first. "You have any idea who might want your operation disrupted?" "I have thoughts," Clara said, "not proof. Tell me your thoughts." "Peter Garnett," she said. Pruitt's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes shifted. Peter Garnett ran the only other soap and cleaning goods operation in the county, a supply business out of a warehouse on the north side of town that had held a near monopoly on commercial cleaning products in the region for the better part of a decade. He sourced everything from Eastern manufacturers and sold at prices that had always seemed steep to Clara, though she'd had no alternative until now. He had a great deal to lose from her Denver distributor arrangement. "That's a serious accusation," Pruitt said. "I said it was a thought," Clara said. "Not an accusation. I want to be clear on that. I'm not asking you to arrest anyone. I'm asking you to document what happened here and investigate it properly." He looked at her for a moment. Then he took out his own notebook. "All right," he said. "Show me everything from the beginning." She showed him. He wrote it all down, the container states, the water addition, the latch damage, the timeline. He was thorough, and he was quiet about it, which she appreciated. When he was done, he told her he'd ask some questions around town and get back to her, and he left without making promises he might not be able to keep, which she also appreciated. June arrived at 5:15 to find Clara already dumping the compromised lie. "What are you doing?" June said, stopping in the doorway. "Throwing it out." Why? June came closer, saw the containers, saw Clara's face. "What happened?" Clara told her. June stood very still through the whole explanation. Then she said, "Garnet." "Maybe. It's Garnet," June said, with the flat certainty of a woman who had worked in this town long enough to know which men resented which women's success and why. "He's been losing accounts for 2 months. Martha Whitmore told me his boy came around trying to sell her cleaning powder last week, and she sent him away. He knows why. Knowing and proving are different things," Clara said. "Right now we have a problem to solve. How much lye do we have in reserve?" June checked. "Enough for maybe 2 batches. Half of what we need for the week. I need to get to Caldwell's when he opens and see what he has in stock. If he's short, I'll send to Pueblo directly." Clara was already writing in her notebook supply list, contingency suppliers, revised production schedule. The Denver order has some flexibility in the first phase. I built in a buffer. We can absorb a 2-day delay without breaking the commitment. "A 2-day delay if everything goes right from here," June said. "Yes," Clara said. "So let's make sure everything goes right from here." Delia arrived at 5:30 and Francis at 5:45, and Clara told them both what had happened with the same directness she'd used with June. No softening, no drama, just facts. Delia's response was to roll up her sleeves and ask what needed doing first. Francis went white and then said something under her breath that Clara decided she hadn't heard. They worked around the shortage, reorganizing the production schedule to maximize what lye supply remained, while Clara rode to Caldwell's the moment the store opened at 7. Everett Caldwell listened to what she needed with the focused attention of a man who understood that his own interests were now meaningfully tied to hers. He had 3 containers of lye in stock. He sold her all 3 at cost, which was not something Everett Caldwell did for anyone. And when she thanked him, he said, "Don't thank me. Just make sure that Denver orders ships on time," and turned back to his shelves. She was back at the tannery building by 8:15. By noon they were back at full production. It was Tuesday. It was also the day Clara found out that word of the break-in had already moved through Willow Creek the way all important news moved through Willow Creek, faster than any person could have intentionally carried it. By some mysterious collective mechanism that meant everyone knew everything important by the time the sun was directly overhead. She knew because Martha Whitmore arrived at the tannery building at noon with a covered dish and an expression that said she was furious on Clara's behalf and intended to do something about it. "Sit down," Martha said, setting the dish on the work table with the authority of a woman who had decided that lunch was opinion, regardless of anyone's opinion. "Eat something. You've been up since before 4. Clara sat. She was, in fact, very hungry, which she had not allowed herself to notice until this moment. "People are talking," Martha said, pulling the cloth off the dish chicken and biscuits, still warm. "About the break-in, about Garnett." "I didn't say it was Garnett," Clara said. "Nobody needed you to say it," Martha said. "People in this town have eyes. Garnett lost the hotel account last month, lost 2 of the ranch supply contracts the week before that. Everyone knows why, and everyone knows he knows why." She sat down across from Clara. "Dale Pruitt went to see him this morning." Clara looked up. "Already?" she said. "Before 9, Martha said. "I heard it from Alice Pratt, who heard it from Peters at Finch's office, who saw Pruitt walking toward Garnett's warehouse at 8:45 with his deputy." The information network of a small frontier town, Clara thought, was genuinely remarkable. And Clara said, and Garnett denied everything, naturally. Said he'd been home all night, said his wife could confirm it. Martha's expression made clear what she thought of that confirmation. But Pruitt apparently asked to see his back storeroom, and Garnett let him, and Pruitt found a pry tool with fresh scratch marks on it. Clara set down her fork. "That doesn't prove it was used at my building," she said carefully. "No," Martha agreed, "it doesn't. Dale knows that. But he told Agnes Hollenbeck, who told me that he considers it a significant finding, and he's continuing to investigate." Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I don't want this to become a public war. I don't want people choosing sides, and the whole thing turning into something bigger than it needs to be." Martha looked at her steadily. "Sometimes other people make that decision for you." "I know," Clara said. "I'm still saying I don't want it." "What do you want?" "I want to ship my Denver order on time," Clara said. "I want to keep my people working. I want whoever did this to understand that disrupting my operation costs them more than it costs me, and I want that understood quietly and permanently." She picked up her fork again. "That's what I want." Martha watched her eat for a moment. Then she said quietly, "You know what I thought when I first heard about you buying those fat pails from Bellamy?" "Something unflattering, I'd imagine," Clara said. "I thought you were going to embarrass yourself," Martha said. "I want to be honest about that. I thought you were going to spend a few weeks making a mess and then quietly go back to laundry and the whole thing would be forgotten." She paused. "I was wrong. I know," Clara said. "I'm telling you because I want you to understand that my opinion of you now is the real one," Martha said. "Not the polite one. Not the revised one, because you're successful. You built something real, and you built it the hard way, and what happened this morning is because someone is afraid of you." She met Clara's eyes. "Being afraid of is a different thing than being laughed at. It means you've already won something." Clara looked at her across the work table. "Thank you, Martha," she said. "Don't get sentimental on me," Martha said, standing up and recovering the dish. "Finish your lunch." Pruitt came back at 4 that afternoon. He came alone, which meant what he had to say was not for general hearing, and Clara brought him to the back table and waited. "I can't charge Garnet," he said. "Not yet. The pry tool is circumstantial." His wife confirms he was home. "I've got no witness, no direct evidence placing him at your building." He paused. "But I want to tell you something off the record." "All right. I've been sheriff in this county for 9 years," Pruitt said. "I know when a man is lying to me. Garnet was lying to me this morning. I don't know yet if I can prove it, but I know it." He looked at her directly. "I'm going to keep looking. I want you to know that." "I appreciate it," Clara said. "In the meantime," he said, "I'd suggest you get a better latch on that back door. And maybe have someone check the building before you unlock it in the mornings for a while." "Already arranged," Clara said. He nodded and stood. "One more thing. I talked to 3 men this morning independent of the Garnet matter about your operation. About how it's growing and what it means for this town." He paused. "There's talk about whether the council should formally recognize your business. Not just as a local shop, as a significant commercial enterprise." He seemed slightly uncomfortable delivering this, like a man reading from a script that had surprised him. "I thought you should know that conversation is happening." Clara looked at him. "Who's having it?" "Caldwell started it," Pruitt said. "Moss backed him up. A couple of the ranchers who've been buying your product for their bunkhouses got wind of the Denver arrangement, and he stopped. Let's just say Willow Creek doesn't often produce something that reaches Denver in its first year. People are noticing what that means." He left. Clara sat at the back table for a long moment after he was gone. Then she called June over. "I need to ask you something," she said. June sat down. "When Garnet's people came around last month," Clara said, "trying to sell to the hotel, to the ranches, did you hear anything about what they were saying? About us specifically?" June was quiet for a moment. "Frances heard something," she said. "She didn't tell you because she didn't want to bother you." "Tell me now." June called Frances over. Frances came with that careful expression she wore when she was uncertain whether she was in trouble. "Tell me what you heard about Garnet," Clara said. Frances looked at her hands for a moment. "Then his boy was at the hotel. Agnes Hollenbeck's cousin works there. The boy was telling the hotel manager that your soap was that you were using inferior materials. That the quality would fall off once you scaled up. That you didn't have the capacity to fill large orders reliably." She paused. "And that a woman running an operation like yours without a male partner was a bad business risk. That you'd fold within 6 months. The room was very quiet." "He said that," Clara said. "Not a confirming." "Yes, ma'am," Frances said. Clara nodded. "Thank you, Frances. That's useful." Frances went back to her station. Clara looked at June. "Garnet isn't just afraid of losing accounts," Clara said. "He's been actively trying to undermine us with potential customers." "Yes," June said. "Then I need to know exactly which accounts he approached, and what he said to them." "That might take some asking around." "Then let's start asking," Clara said. "Quietly, carefully. I want names and I want specifics." It took 4 days. Martha helped. Agnes Hollenbeck's cousin at the hotel helped more than expected. And Vera Dunning, who did laundry for half the town's business establishments and heard everything, provided 3 names that Clara hadn't known about. By Saturday morning, Clara had a clear picture. Garnet had approached 7 potential accounts in the past 6 weeks, telling each of them variations of the same story: that Clara's operation was unstable, that her product quality was unreliable, that dealing with a woman-run business without male oversight was a risk no serious commercial enterprise should take. 2 of the 7 had chosen not to approach Clara as a result. She sat with that number. 2 accounts she hadn't gotten because Peter Garnet had poisoned the well before she could reach it. She wrote both names in her notebook. She wrote down everything she'd been told about what Garnet had said to each of them. Then she made a decision. She would not go to those 2 accounts to complain about Garnet. She would not go to defend herself or explain or ask them to reconsider. She would go to them the same way. She'd gone to every count she had with her product and her numbers and her terms, and she would let the work speak for what the work was. She went Monday morning. The first was the Willow Creek Hotel, which was the largest establishment in town, and which she'd always known would be a significant account if she could land it. The manager was a man named Aldous Crane, mid-50s, originally from Chicago, had been running the hotel for 3 years, and had no patience for anything that wasted his time. He was behind the front desk when Clara came in. "Mr. Crane," she said. "Clara Holloway, I'd like 10 minutes of your time." He looked at her with the expression of a man who had been told something about her and was now measuring that something against the reality standing in front of him. "Miss Holloway," he said, "I've heard your name recently." "I expect you have," she said. "I'd like you to hear it from me." He considered that for a moment. Then he lifted the desk panel and gestured her through to the office behind. She gave him 10 minutes exactly. She brought 2 bars of each variety, the plain, the lavender, the oatmeal, and she brought her production record for the past 8 weeks, which showed consistent output, no missed deliveries to any account, and steadily increasing volume. She brought the signed letter of intent from George Alderman's distribution company in Denver. She did not mention Garnett. She did not need to. Aldous Crane was a man who had run a hotel for 3 years, which meant he was a man who knew the difference between a business that was real and a business that was not, and what Clara laid on his desk was real in every particular. He picked up the Denver letter and read it carefully. "A Denver distributor," he said. "Signed 6 weeks ago," Clara said. "And you've filled your first phase volume. On schedule, yes." He set the letter down. He picked up the lavender bar, turned it over, smelled it. Set it back down. "My current cleaning supply contract with Garnett runs through the end of December," he said. "I'm not asking you to break a contract," Clara said. "I'm asking you to consider where you want to be in January." He looked at her. "I'll have my decision to you by the end of next week," he said. "That's fine," Clara said. She stood, extended her hand, and he shook it. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Crane." The second account was a ranch supply operation 15 miles outside town, the Meridian Ranch, which supplied cleaning products to 6 smaller operations in the area and had enough combined volume to matter significantly. The owner was a woman, which Clara had not known until she rode out there and found herself sitting across from a lean-weathered woman of about 60 named Harriet Collier, who ran the ranch with her son and had opinions about everything. Harriet did not waste time. "You're the soap woman," she said when Clara introduced herself. "Yes, ma'am. Garnett's boy was out here last month. Said you'd fit in 6 months. I have a signed distribution agreement with a Denver wholesaler," Clara said. "I've filled every order on time for every account I have. I have a production facility, 3 employees, and a 6-month growth plan that's ahead of schedule." She paused. "Does that sound like a business that's going to fold?" Harriet looked at her for a long moment, the kind of looking that older women do when they've spent enough decades watching the world to have developed an accurate calibration for the difference between bluster and substance. "No," she said. "It doesn't." "Then I'd like to discuss terms," Clara said. She rode back to Willow Creek with the Meridian Ranch account and an order for the following week. She came through the main street at dusk, and the town was doing what it always did at that hour, settling into evening. The stores closing, people moving between buildings, the particular rhythm of a place that knew what it was and how it worked. Except it was starting to work slightly differently than it had before. She could feel it, not dramatically, not in any single thing she could point to, but in the accumulation of small things. The way Caldwell's customers asked for her soap by name at his counter. The way Thomas Bellamy had begun saving her the larger fat pails without being asked. The way Pruitt nodded to her from across the street with the nod he gave to people whose business he took seriously. She tied her horse outside the tannery building and went in to check the day's production figures. June had left a note on the table. Day total 67 bars. Denver Phase 2 on track. Cranberry received a letter C envelope on your chair. Clara looked at the envelope on her chair. It was from George Alderman's office in Denver. She opened it. It was not a problem. It was the opposite of a problem. Alderman wrote that two of his retailers, one in Colorado Springs, one in Pueblo, had reported customer demand for her soap significantly exceeding their initial stock. He was requesting an increase to the Phase 2 volume, effective immediately, and wanted to know if she could accommodate it. He wanted 40% more than the agreed volume. 40%. Clara sat down in her chair. She did the arithmetic. The production capacity, the staffing, the supply chain. The timeline. It was possible. Not comfortable, it would require another hire, possibly two, and she'd need to talk to Bellamy about increasing supply again, and the curing space was going to be the tightest constraint, but it was possible. She wrote back that evening, confirmed. Phase 2 volume increase accepted. First adjusted shipment in 3 weeks. Then she, in the notebook, two more women. Talk to June tomorrow about candidates. She closed the notebook. She sat in the empty building for a moment with the lamp burning low and thought about Peter Garnett in his warehouse on the north side of town, who had broken into her building and watered her lie and sent his boy out to poison her accounts, and whose plan had accomplished nothing except making her move faster and look more carefully at the places she hadn't yet reached. She almost felt sorry for him. Almost. The next morning, Pruitt came to her building at 7 with his deputy and a piece of paper. I found my witness, he said. Clara looked at him. Who? Peters, Finch's clerk. Pruitt's voice was even. He was working late at the office 2 nights before your break-in. Said he saw Garnett's delivery man boy named Cullen coming out of the alley behind your building at around 10 at night. Thought nothing of it at the time. When I talked to him yesterday and described what happened, he remembered. Cullen, Clara said. I talked to Cullen this morning. He's 22 years old and he doesn't have much appetite for taking responsibility for something Garnett told him to do. Pruitt paused. He told me everything. The room was still. What happens now? Clara said. Garnett will be formally charged, Pruitt said. Criminal mischief, malicious damage to property. It won't be a dramatic proceeding. He'll most likely pay a fine and restitution. He looked at her directly. I want to be honest with you. This county doesn't have a history of hard consequences for men like Garnett. What I can promise you is that it goes on record, formally. Publicly. Clara thought about that. Public record is enough, she said. Let it be known what he did and why he did it. That's the consequence I care about. Pruitt nodded. There's one more thing. When I interviewed Cullen, he told me some of what Garnett had been saying around town about your business. The things he'd told potential accounts. He paused. Cullen said Garnett specifically told the hotel and 3 ranch operations that a woman your size couldn't run a serious business. That your physical appearance was evidence you lacked the discipline for it. Clara was very still. He said that. She said, yes, ma'am. She looked at the production floor, at the curing racks with their rows of finished bars, at the work tables where June and Delia and Francis would be arriving in 20 minutes, at the notebook on her table with 8 weeks of numbers that said what discipline looked like when it was applied every single day without exception. Put that in the formal record, too, she said. Every word of it. Pruitt looked at her. Yes, ma'am, he said quietly. The formal charge against Peter Garnett was filed that Friday. By Saturday, it was the only thing anyone in Willow Creek was talking about. Clara did not go to town on Saturday. She stayed at the tannery building and worked, and she sent June to Caldwell's for supplies. And when June came back, she reported that the conversation at Caldwell's counter had been entirely about Garnett and what he'd done and what he'd said, and that the general feeling appeared to be one of collective embarrassment, the particular embarrassment of a community that has been reminded of something ugly it allowed to exist unchallenged. Caleb Foster was there, June said, setting down the supply basket. What did he say? He said, and I'm quoting directly. June paused for effect. A man who attacks a woman's work because he can't match it deserves whatever comes to him. Clara looked at her. Caleb Foster said that, she said. In front of 6 people, June confirmed. Clara turned back to her mixing station. Well, she said. That's all you've got, June said. Caleb Foster publicly defended you, and all you've got as well. What would you like me to say? I don't know something. React. I am reacting, Clara said. I'm making soap. That's my reaction to everything. It's been working so far. June stared at her for a moment. Then she laughed a real laugh, the kind that comes up unexpectedly from somewhere genuine, and went back to her station. Clara kept mixing. She was thinking about what Martha had said. Being afraid of is a different thing than being laughed at. It means you've already won something. She hadn't fully understood it when Martha said it. She understood it now. Peter Garnett hadn't broken into her building because he thought she would fail. He'd broken in because he knew she wouldn't. And that knowledge, that certainty on his part, expressed in the most desperate and destructive way available to him, was the clearest measure she had yet of how far she'd come from the woman who had pushed a handcart through Willow Creek with rancid fat. Pails and kept her face forward and her feet moving. She had come far enough that men with something to lose were afraid of her. She mixed the batch through to trace, poured it clean and even, smoothed the surface, covered it. 67 bars, same as yesterday. She wrote the number in her notebook. Then she picked up her pen and wrote below it, in her careful straight handwriting. Garnett charged. 2 new accounts secured. Denver Phase 2 confirmed at increased volume. Hire 2 additional workers Monday. She looked at the numbers. Then she looked at the first page of the notebook, the page from 8 weeks ago, the page that said first mistake discovered, and she looked at how far the entries had come from that first page to this one. She closed the notebook. She went home to sleep. Tomorrow there was more to do, and Clara May Holloway had never once in her life wasted a night worrying about things she could fix in the morning. The 2 new women started on Monday. Their names were Bess Hartley and Cordelia Drummond. Bess was 31, had spent 4 years working in a laundry house in Denver before her husband brought her out to Willow Creek and then died of pneumonia the following winter, leaving her with a small son and a very large problem. Cordelia was 44, had grown up on a farm, and had the kind of physical endurance that comes from a lifetime of work that never once waited for conditions to be convenient. June had found them both in 48 hours, which did not surprise Clara. June had turned out to be something Clara hadn't anticipated when she first knocked on that door with a job offer, not just a worker, not just a fast learner, but a genuine second in command. Someone who understood the operation well enough to make real decisions when Clara wasn't there, and who had the judgment to know which decisions those were. Clara had not said this to June directly. She said it in the way that mattered in the adjusted pay envelope at the end of November, which was 30% higher than their original agreement, with a note that said simply, "Your rate reflects your actual contribution." It should have been this from the start. June had read the note and said nothing for a moment. Then she'd folded it carefully and put it in her apron pocket and gone back to work. That was the whole of it, and it was enough, with 5 women working the production floor. The morning output increased to a number that Clara had to check twice, because she still caught herself applying the mental limits of her old backyard setup to a situation that had outgrown them completely. They were producing consistently, shipping on time, and the Denver Phase 2 volume, the increased volume Alderman had requested, was not straining them the way she'd originally calculated it might. Which meant she needed to think further ahead than she had been. She was at her kitchen table on a Sunday evening with her notebook and her lamp when it occurred to her, with the quiet certainty of something that should have been obvious sooner, that she had been thinking about the wrong problem. She had been thinking about production capacity. She should have been thinking about what the product could become. She had 3 varieties: plain, lavender, oatmeal. They were good, they were honest, they sold consistently, and they held their quality, and she was proud of every bar that left her building. But she had been making the same 3 varieties since October, and it was now the first week of January. and the market she was supplying had grown from 11 individual customers in Willow Creek to 47 retail locations across 2 territories with a third territory pending. Those customers were not all the same. A ranch bunkhouse supply account needed something different from what the Willow Creek Hotel needed. What Harriet Collier's Meridian Ranch operations required was not what the women on Martha Whitmore's street were choosing on their own. And what Agnes Hollenbeck's sister in Denver was apparently now specifically requesting she had sent a letter, an actual personal letter. Asking whether Clara made anything with a stronger scent for winter skin was not yet something Clara had on offer. She wrote for 3 hours. By the end she had sketched out 4 new varieties, the supply requirements for each, the price points, the target accounts. She had a development timeline that she thought was realistic. She had questions she needed answered about ingredient sourcing that she couldn't answer from memory. She also had, at the bottom of the last page, a word she had not written in her notebook before. Expansion. She looked at the word for a while. Then she went to bed with the particular restlessness of someone whose mind has gone somewhere her life hasn't caught up to yet. She was back in the building at 4:40 the next morning. The letter from George Alderman arrived on Wednesday. She read it standing at the work table, because she'd learned by now not to sit down for letters from Alderman. They tended to contain numbers that required her to maintain her physical stability. He was writing to inform her that 2 of his largest retail partners, one in Colorado Springs, one that had just opened a new store in Santa Fe, had specifically requested that Holloway soap be featured in their spring merchandise displays. Featured, meaning front-of-store placement, meaning the stores would be actively promoting her product, rather than simply stocking it. He wanted to know if she could supply an additional volume on top of the already increased Phase 2 commitment, starting in March. He also wanted to know, and this was the line that made her set the letter down on the work table and press both palms flat on the surface for a moment, whether she had considered developing a gift presentation version of her product. Something packaged more elaborately than the current brown string wrapping. Something that could be positioned as a premium item for the holiday trade. She had not considered it. She was considering it now. She called June over and handed her the letter without saying anything. June read it. Her lips moved slightly on the large numbers. She handed it back. Gift packaging, June said. Yes. Do you know anything about gift packaging? No, Clara said. But I know someone who might. She was already reaching for her coat. Hold the morning batch at Trace. I'll be back in an hour. She went to see Martha Whitmore. Martha, it turned out, had opinions about gift packaging that she had apparently been storing up for some time, waiting for the right occasion. She had spent 3 years before coming to Willow Creek working in a dry goods store in St. Louis that had specialized in luxury household items, and she understood presentation the way she understood soap quality as a matter of function, not decoration. Because presentation told a customer what a product believed about itself before they'd touched it. Muslin wrap, Martha said, immediately and without preamble, as if Clara had simply resumed a conversation they'd already been having. Not brown paper. Something with texture, tied with a proper ribbon, not string ribbon. And a small card with the variety name and what it's for. Not fancy language. Plain language. For dry skin in winter. For laundry and heavy use. Something that tells a woman in 30 seconds exactly what she's holding. Clara looked at her. Do you want to come work for me, she said. Martha looked back at her. I'm 53 years old. I know, I have my own household to run, I know that, too. I'm not asking you to stand at a production table. I'm asking if you want a formal role in product development and presentation. A few hours a week, your own rate. Martha was quiet for a moment. The particular quiet of someone who has been offered something they want and are deciding whether to admit it. What rate, she said. Clara told her. Martha said, when do I start? You already started, Clara said. The muslin wrap idea is the first decision. Keep going. They spent 2 hours at Martha's kitchen table developing the gift packaging concept, the materials, the presentation, the card language, the pricing for the premium tier. Martha had more practical knowledge about retail presentation than Clara had expected. And the combination of Martha's instinct for what women wanted to see and Clara's understanding of what the product actually was something that felt, by the end of those 2 hours, genuinely right. Clara went back to the building and told June they were adding a gift presentation line. June said that's going to add an hour to our morning. I know, Clara said. We'll figure it out. They figured it out. The gift line was ready by the first week of February, and Alderman's response when Clara sent him samples was 3 words in a telegram: ship immediately. More, she shipped more. It was also in February that Gerald Finch came to see her about the lease. She had not forgotten that the 1-year lease was approaching its midpoint, which meant the renewal conversation was coming. And she had been thinking about that conversation with the careful attention she gave to any negotiation she knew was significant. Finch was not a hostile man, but he was a man who understood leverage, and he now understood, in a way he had not when he'd first signed her lease, that the tannery building housed something considerably more valuable than a local cottage industry. He came on a Tuesday afternoon, which was his way of choosing the time, arriving when she was in the middle of production, when the building was busy, and she might feel the pressure of the interruption. Clara had June take over the floor and brought Finch to the back table. He looked better prepared than their first meeting. He had papers, he had numbers, and he had a new lease offer that was 60% higher than her current rate. She looked at the number, did not react to it visibly. "Set it down, Mr. Finch," she said. "You know what this building was worth when it was empty." "I know what it's worth now," he said. "You know what it's worth because of what I built in it," Clara said. "That's not the same as the building's value. I brought the value. The building is 4 walls and a roof with a good fire pit." "A fire pit you've been using very profitably," he said. "Yes," she said, "and if I move my operation to a different building, which I've been looking at, incidentally. Because a woman in my position looks at all her options, your building goes back to being 4 walls and a roof with a good fire pit that nobody wants to lease." Finch was quiet. "You've been looking at other buildings," he said. "I have." This was true. She had asked Henry Moss about the empty mill warehouse 2 weeks ago, purely as a contingency exercise, and the exercise had told her that her options were real. "I'd rather stay where I am. The setup suits my operation, and relocating would cost me a month of reduced output. I'm willing to pay a fair increase for renewal. I'm not willing to pay 60% more for the same building." "What's your offer?" he said. She named 20%. He came back with 40, 25, she said, and a 2-year term instead of 1. He looked at her across the table. She could see him running the arithmetic, the stability of a 2-year lease, against the gamble of holding out for more from a tenant who had just told him she had alternatives. 30, he said. "Done," Clara said. He shook her hand with the expression of a man who keeps almost winning negotiations with her, and has not yet decided how to feel about it. When he left, Delia, who had been working close enough to hear most of it, said without looking up from her station, 30%. "Yes," Clara said. "You got him down from 60. "That's impressive," Delia said. "That's arithmetic," Clara said. "Same as everything else." The day the Garnett case was formally resolved was a Thursday in late February. Pruitt came to tell her himself, which she appreciated. Garnett had paid his fine, and the restitution covered her lost lye supply, and the production delay, and the formal record noted the malicious nature of the act and the motivation behind it. Pruitt had insisted on the language about what Garnett had said to her potential accounts being included in the official record, and the judge had allowed it. "It's done," Pruitt said, "publicly and permanently." "Thank you, Dale," Clara said. She had started using his first name somewhere in the course of this, and he had not objected. "Garnett's business is in trouble," Pruitt said. "Lost 4 more accounts last month." Word gets around, it always does, Clara said, in both directions. He nodded. You've built something worth protecting, he said. I'm glad I could do my part. He left and Clara stood in the middle of her production floor and thought about Peter Garnett in his warehouse, losing accounts, and felt precisely nothing hostile. No satisfaction at his difficulty. No desire for anything more than what the formal record contained. The work was enough. The work had always been enough. What she felt, if she had to name it, was something closer to sadness, the particular sadness of watching a man choose destruction over adaptation, when he could have chosen differently and done well enough. The market was growing. There was room. He had decided there wasn't, and that decision had cost him everything it was going to cost him, and none of it had anything to do with her except that she was the thing he'd decided to be afraid of. She went back to work. March arrived with a letter that made her sit down. It was from a woman named Catherine Alderman, George Alderman's wife, and it was not a business communication. It was personal, which was unusual enough to make Clara read it twice before she understood what it was. Catherine Alderman had heard about Clara's business from her husband, naturally. But she had heard more than the numbers. She had heard the story of the fat pails, the failed batches, the break-in, the negotiation that got her into the Denver distribution network, because George Alderman apparently told his wife everything, which Clara noted as a piece of information about the man that she found unexpectedly endearing. Catherine was writing to tell her that she had shared the story with 3 women in her social circle in Denver. And those women had shared it further. And the result of that sharing was that Catherine wanted to know if Clara would consider coming to Denver to speak at a meeting of a women's civic organization, not about soap, specifically, but about what she had built and how she had built it. Clara read the letter 3 times. She set it on the table. She picked it up and read it again. She went to find June. Someone wants me to speak in Denver, she said, at a women's meeting. June looked at her. About what? About building something. About the business. June said nothing for a moment. Then are you going to do it? Clara looked at the letter. I don't make speeches, she said. You talk to merchants all day long, June said. You talked Finch down from 60%. You negotiated with a Denver distributor in the back of a tannery building and came out with better terms than he walked in offering. How is that different? That's business, Clara said. That's numbers. You think those women in Denver want to hear about numbers? June said. They want to hear about you carrying those pails through town while Caleb Foster shouted at you from across the street. They want to hear about the notebook, about writing first mistake discovered instead of failed. She paused. Clara, someone out there has a barrel of rotten fat that everybody told her was worthless. You need to go tell her what to do with it. Clara looked at her assistant, this woman she'd hired out of desperation and gratitude 8 months ago, this woman who had arrived at 4:57 on her first Monday and had never once been late since. When did you get so wise? Clara said. I learned from somebody, June said, and went back to work. Clara wrote to Catherine Alderman that evening. Yes. She would come to Denver in April. She would speak about what she knew, which was work and persistence, and the arithmetic of turning what other people discard into something people need. She sent the letter before she could think about it too carefully. She spent the next 4 weeks doing what she always did, working, refining, recording, adjusting, but underneath the daily rhythm there was something building. A low-level awareness of the April trip that she kept firmly in its place, because she had learned a long time ago that anticipating things too hard was a reliable way to ruin them. She was in the building on a Thursday morning when Caleb Foster came through the front door for the 3rd time since this whole thing had started, and she knew from the way he was moving purposeful, not hesitant, not delivering something from someone else, that this visit was different from the others. He stopped in front of her. I heard about Denver, he said. Word travels, Clara said. He stopped. He was a man who talked easily in most situations, and this was not one of them. I wanted to say something to you that I should have said a while back. Clara waited. "I gave you a hard time," he said. "For a long time. Not just the Pails thing. For years before that. The comments. The way I talked about you in front of people." He looked at the floor and then back up. "I told myself it wasn't serious. That it was just the way people talked. The way things were." He stopped. "Watching what you built. Watching Garnett come after you because he was afraid of you, and watching you handle it like you handled everything else." He stopped again. "I was wrong about you. I was wrong in a way that cost you things I can't give back. I'm sorry for it." The building was quiet, not the strained quiet of people pretending not to listen. The genuine quiet of people understanding that something real was happening and giving it the space it needed. Clara looked at Caleb Foster, this man whose voice had followed her down the street for years, whose laughter had been the particular background noise of her most difficult mornings, and she found that the feeling she had was not what she would have predicted. Not anger, not satisfaction, not even relief. It was something much simpler. It was tired, not in her body was fine, but in the part of her that had been carrying the weight of what he and people like him had given her to carry. For years, for so long she'd stopped noticing the weight, the way you stop noticing anything you've worn long enough. "I appreciate you saying that," she said. "I mean it." He nodded. "If Ruth needs anything," Clara said, "tell her to send word." He almost smiled. "She's already writing you a letter, I think." "Tell her I'll read it," Clara said. He left. June appeared at her elbow 30 seconds later. "Was that," Clara said. "Caleb Foster actually apologized." "He did," Lord June said quietly. "Keep moving," Clara said. "We have 60 bars to get through before noon." They kept moving. April came. Clara rode the train to Denver for the first time in her life. Sitting upright in her seat with her hands folded in her lap and her notebook in her bag, and the particular interior stillness of a woman who has survived enough surprising things to know that the best way through a new one is to observe it clearly and react to what's actually there rather than what you imagined. Denver was larger than she'd expected and louder and faster, and the hotel where Catherine Alderman had arranged her stay was considerably nicer than anything Clara had ever been inside as a guest rather than a worker. And she sat in the room that evening after dinner and looked at the ceiling and thought about being 32 years old and standing behind Bellamy's butcher shop with her hands in a barrel of rotten fat, while a man laughed at her from across the street. She thought about the notebook. She had brought it. The original one, not a copy, not a summary. The actual notebook with the actual pages. Starting from the first batch failure, all the way to the current production figures and the Denver distribution numbers and the Finch lease renewal and Alderman's spring merchandise placement. She opened it to the first page. First mistake discovered. Then she closed it and went to sleep. The meeting was held in a large room above a dry goods store, which struck Clara as exactly right. Somehow, and there were 43 women seated when she arrived, ranging in age from what looked like early 20s to a woman in the front row who had to be at least 75 and who was looking at Clara with the particular interested intensity of someone who intended to remember everything she heard. Catherine Alderman was exactly as her letters suggested, warm, precise, genuinely intelligent, with none of the condescension that Clara had been half-brist for from a wealthy Denver woman looking at a former laundress from a small frontier town. She introduced Clara simply. "This is Clara May Holloway of Willow Creek, Colorado." She built a business from what everyone else threw away. "I'll let her tell you how." Clara stood up in front of 43 women and held her notebook in both hands and told them. She told them about the barrels, about the arithmetic, about her grandmother, about Caleb Foster's voice carrying across the street and the choice to keep walking, about the failed batches, all 3 of them, and what she wrote in the notebook after each one. About Martha Whitmore saying, "I'll take all 6," with the tone of a woman simply buying something she wanted. About June arriving at 4:57 and never once being late. About Garnett and what he'd done and why he'd done it, and what it had actually meant about where she was. She told them about the Denver distribution agreement and what the room had looked like: a wooden table and 2 chairs in the back of a tannery building when she shook George Alderman's hand. She did not tell them it was impressive. She did not tell them they could do it too. She did not perform inspiration for them. She just told them what had happened, in order, clearly, the way she wrote in her notebook, because that was the only thing she knew how to do that was actually useful. When she finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Then the woman in the front row, the one who was at least 75, said, "What did you write in that notebook after the 3rd batch succeeded?" Clara looked at her. "I wrote 'This is working,'" Clara said. The woman nodded slowly. "That's the whole story right there," she said. The questions went on for an hour. Clara answered every one of them straight: the ones about capital, the ones about suppliers, the ones about negotiating with men who didn't take you seriously, the ones about what to do when someone actively works to destroy what you've built. She answered them the same way she ran her business, without performance, without softening, without pretending that any of it had been easier than it was. At the end, a young woman, she couldn't have been more than 23, came up to her and stood close and said quietly, "I have an idea. I've had it for 2 years. Everyone I've told thinks it's foolish." Clara looked at her. "Does the arithmetic work?" Clara said. The young woman blinked. Yes, I've done it many times." "Then stop asking people if your idea is foolish," Clara said. "People told you what they thought before they understood what you saw. That's the wrong order. Build the thing first, then let them see it." The young woman looked at her. "Write everything down," Clara added. "Every mistake, every adjustment. That's where the knowledge lives, in the record of what you tried and what you learned. Not in what anyone told you before you started." She shook the young woman's hand and said goodbye to Catherine Alderman and walked out into the Denver street. She was back in Willow Creek the next evening. June had a production update waiting on her table, which was exactly as it should be. 61 bars the day before, 64 that day. Denver shipment on track. New account inquiry from a merchant in Albuquerque. Clara read it. Then she sat down at the back table and opened her notebook to a new page and started writing. Not a speech, not a reflection. The production figures for the coming week, the supply order, the staffing rotation. She was home. A week later, Henry Moss stopped her on the street. "I heard your Denver speech went well," he said. "It wasn't a speech," Clara said. "I just told them what happened." "Same thing," Henry said. Catherine Alderman wrote to someone who wrote to someone else. "Apparently, a woman in Santa Fe wants to have you come speak there." Clara stopped walking. "Santa Fe," she said. "That's what I heard." She stood in the middle of the Willow Creek Main Street and looked at him. "You know what's funny," she said. "A year ago, I couldn't get people in this town to take me seriously. Now someone in Santa Fe wants to hear me talk." Henry looked at her steadily. "A year ago, you were carrying fat pails through town," he said. "Now your soap is in 47 stores and a Denver distributor is asking for more. Things change when you build something real." "Things change," Clara agreed. She went back to the building. June was at the mixing table when she came in, and Delia was at the curing racks, and Bess was doing the supply inventory, and Cordelia was working the rendering pot. And Frances was wrapping the gift line with the muslin and ribbon that Martha had specified, and the whole operation was running the way it ran every morning, efficiently, without drama, with the quiet competence of people who knew their work and did it well. Clara stood in the doorway and looked at all of it. She thought about the first Tuesday morning she'd come to collect pails from Bellamy, with her handcart and its grinding wheels, alone, with Caleb Foster's voice following her down the street. She thought about her grandmother's kitchen in Tennessee. She thought about sitting at her table at 10 o'clock at night, with a failed batch in the corner and a pencil in her hand, deciding what to write. She had decided to write "First Mistake Discovered." That decision, that single small, private decision in the cold of her kitchen, had led here. To 5 women working, to 47 stores, to Denver. To Santa Fe, apparently. To a young woman in a room above a dry goods store who had an idea she'd been told was foolish for 2 years. She crossed to her table. She sat down. She opened her notebook to the current page. She wrote the date. She wrote the morning's production target. She wrote the supply figures and the delivery schedule, and the Albuquerque inquiry and the note about Santa Fe. Then at the bottom of the page, below the numbers, she wrote something that was not a number. She did not do this. Often the notebook was for records, for facts, for the concrete information that made the work possible. But occasionally, rarely, she allowed herself a line that was something else. She wrote, "The first pail cost 2 cents, everything else was work." She looked at it. Then she picked up her pen and added one more line, because it was true, and because her grandmother had given it to her and she intended to keep giving it forward, for as long as she had breath to do so. Waste is only waste when nobody knows what it can become. She closed the notebook. She stood up. She called across the floor to June that she was ready to start the morning batch. June said they were already at temperature and waiting on her. Clara rolled up her sleeves and went to the mixing table and began the work that she would do the next day, and that day after that, and every day after that, for as long as her hands and her mind held the plain, essential, deeply dignified work of a woman who had looked at what the world threw away and understood, before anyone else did, exactly what it was worth. Clara May Holloway had started with 2 cents and an idea that everyone called foolish. She had built something that reached across 2 territories and was still growing, not because the world had finally decided to believe in her, but because she had never once waited for that permission. That was the whole story. That was all of it, and it was enough.